I thought that by putting a rather unpleasant slide up, you might actually look at me more. So this is from a website called Slavery Footprint. I'm not going to endorse their methodology. I haven't looked deeply enough into it, but it's rather a shocking outcome. So I've done the testing, and they take you through, what you consume in terms of food, in terms of clothing, jewelry, what you drive, where you live, whether you have children, etc., etc. And I don't own a television, I don't own a car, I'm virtually vegetarian, and yet I have 47 people working for me for free. And that's rather a shocking statistic to me. The average, I think, is around 70, 75. I challenge anyone in this room to turn around and say, that's okay, I don't want to do anything about it. So modern slavery is one of the probably most let's say, commonly cited elements of human rights abuses today in people's supply chains. But human rights are everywhere. Is there anyone here who could name me a human right, a fundamental human right, that is enshrined in law in Australia and that is relevant to your business? What about discrimination? The right to not be discriminated against is a fundamental human right. Anyone else? No? Privacy? The right to bargain collectively. All those are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They're also in various other treaties that your country has signed up to. Some of them have been implemented into Australian law, some haven't. And traditionally, the interesting thing is that human rights was the preserve of states. So when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted in 1948, it was just after the Second World War, and people were pretty horrified by what some states had been able to achieve. So they put together this declaration. They later came with a lot more binding treaties, the two covenants, and the rights of the child, the rights of women, etc. And they said states have a duty to protect people against themselves, in theory, and against infringements from other people. But as time has gone on, it's been realized that corporations and companies actually have an enormous amount of power. And that's really what it's about. Human rights are about checking power, the power that you have to infringe on someone else's right to life, right to privacy, right to health, right to a decent living wage, etc. And so in 2011, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were adopted by unanimity in the United Nations Human Rights Council. So that's the sort of, what are human rights? Why is it important? Why is it important to you in your supply chains? Well, I think we've already hinted at that, and that's going to substantially cut down my presentation. You've talked about the risk of having people in forced labor or bonded labor of some sort in your cleaning teams, for instance. But further down the supply chain, and by no means trying to absolve Australia because it's a Western developed country and so on, very many of your companies will have supply chains in countries which have perhaps less strong frameworks of government and less wish to enforce those frameworks where they are present. It's very difficult to know, and coming back to this, we're all part of this system. So they're important because more and more it's going to become the law. In the UK, you've got the Modern Slavery Act. Before that, you had the Transparency in Supply Chains Act in California. I don't know how many of you have followed the Attorney General's Department's working group on supply chains, but just before Christmas, DFAT put out a statement which essentially, it seems to us, hinted that there would be something similar to the Modern Slavery Act being explored in Australia. So it's the law, but it's also a really bad look. Who here would tell me that if I came and said, well, I just talked to your cleaner and someone's taken away their passport from them and they're not allowed to leave until they've paid back what supposedly their recruiter invested in their hiring? Who here would say that's okay? It's an ethical question. It's the right thing to do to make sure that people are being treated the way that we would want to be treated. So you've got ethics, you've got law, but then as a result of the ethical and legal issues, reputation. Your brand is probably the most valuable asset that you have. And the minute someone starts exposing you and saying, well, you haven't done your due diligence, you haven't looked into your supply chain closely enough, and as a result, people are in serious trouble, that is very often going to affect you in terms of your customer base, sometimes even your share value. So if we look, for instance, in Australia, not in this particular industry, but the 7-Eleven underpayment scandal, that went on for quite a while. The Fair Work Ombudsman has been working on this for months, and it's cost them an enormous amount of money, not just to the franchises, but also to 7-Eleven themselves. The big four banks, Oxfam has been waging a campaign against land grabs. So they're saying, well, it doesn't really matter. You know, you banks, you touch on every single sector around. It doesn't matter that you had no idea that someone's land was being taken away from them, therefore they had no more livelihood. And so with ANZ, for instance, the Phnom Penh sugar issue, despite ANZ arguing in various ways, and probably correctly in line with the United Nations guiding principles, that it was not their responsibility, they hadn't caused or contributed to it. At the end of the day, to preserve their brand, it was more important to them to engage with this question than to shy away from it and sideline it. And if I come to the construction sector specifically, I don't have any good examples from Australia, but FIFA has been severely targeted for the work that's going on in Qatar in terms of building facilities for the next World Championship. And they've actually tried to push back and eventually caved, and they've created a special code for construction which has everything to do with labour hire. And every single construction company that works on the facilities for the 2020, I think it is, championships, has to sign up to this code and will be checked for it. So that's why it's important. Now, what can you do about it? I think, you know, we all know that supply chains are very complex. Jonas illustrated very visibly that, you know, they're all around the world and you don't necessarily know. And that was just tier 3. Some companies will have, you know, up to 30 tiers of suppliers. And then you have to think also of who's transporting things between different suppliers. You know, are the people on ships being treated correctly? That's a notorious industry within which people get underpaid and pseudo-enslaved. So start close to home. Start where you can. Start within your first sort of tier of suppliers. Map those out. And then, as Jonas said, and I don't want to repeat it too much, but try to go also by areas of risk if you don't have sufficient resources to do it all at once. So if you know that you are procuring precious metals from Myanmar, well, maybe that's a good place to start looking. You know, see whether your suppliers have a certain level of certification, etc. And then consider what you have in place to actually check all these things. So the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, I'll call them the UNGPs from now on, they give a certain minimum set of sort of policies and frameworks that need to be in place. You need to have some form of human rights commitment, which in best practice would refer to the International Bill of Rights. Then you need to have a human rights due diligence process. That's quite a vast thing. It goes from the risk assessment to the identification to stakeholder engagement through to addressing and mitigating any risks that you do encounter, and then monitoring, you know, constantly monitoring your operations and your supply base to see whether that evolves, to see whether companies change their ways, etc. And then there's the remedy aspect as well. So where your company may have contributed to an adverse human rights impact, the UNGPs suggest that the company should engage and find some kind of mutually satisfactory solution, which doesn't always have to be about money. Sometimes it's about restoration, sometimes it's just about an apology. And then the last thing I would encourage you to do as well is engage with the specialists. There are lots of really great NGOs, there are consultancies, there are individuals who are really, really plugged into this, who have a lot of experience. And the best possible thing you can do is ask for help. The other thing is join into sector-wide initiatives. I'm not aware of one in the construction sector in Australia at the moment, but there are certainly, there are organisations that can support you. The UN Global Compact would be one of them. So I don't know whether that's sort of remained a little bit too high level and fluffy, but I hope that will have answered a few of your questions about human rights.